Researchers who have spent decades cataloging gray abduction testimony have confirmed a detail the case files were never built to hold: a consistent, repeating account of people taken aboard the craft who were never brought back down. The accounts come from witnesses on 4 continents, separated by as much as 50 years, most of whom had never read a book on the subject and never met another abductee in their lives. Yet under regression, each of them describes the same second room, the same long rows, and the same faces that don't turn to look when the beam brings someone new inside. So if the Greys return almost everyone they take, what makes them keep the ones they keep? I started looking into this because of a footnote, not a case, not a witness, just a footnote buried in a document nobody outside a very small circle has ever read. In 1979, a French researcher named Dr. Marguerite Vasseur, working out of a small aerospace anomalies unit in Toulouse, compiled something she titled The Preliminary Register of Non-Returning Contact Subjects. She'd interviewed roughly 240 people who claimed contact with gray-skinned beings, and she wasn't interested in whether they'd been aboard a ship. She was interested in what they saw while they were up there. Buried on the 11th page, she wrote a single line that stopped me cold. 31 of her subjects, without prompting, reported seeing other human beings on the craft. People who were not in any missing persons database, not in any newspaper, and who did not appear to be leaving. Vasseur died in 1994. Her register was never published. The first case I want you to sit with belongs to a 31-year-old grain elevator operator named Dale Prentice outside Culbertson, Montana in November of 1973. He'd stayed late to run the last truck through, and he was walking the gravel back toward his pickup with his keys already in his hand when the light came down over the field to his left. Not a beam yet, just a glow. Low and cold, sitting over the wheat stubble like it had weight. His first thought wasn't fear. His first thought, exactly as he told it years later, was that somebody had driven a combine out there in the dark and left the headlights on, and he was going to have to walk out and deal with it. He got about 40 steps before he understood there was no machine under the light. The keys were still in his hand when the beam found him, and he remembered the sound of them hitting the gravel more clearly than anything else about that night. What he described afterward was a room with a metal table in it, which is the detail everyone expects. But Dale kept trying to talk about the other room. He said they moved him through a corridor and past an opening on the right, and inside it were people. Standing, not restrained, not struggling, not on tables, standing in rows, 6 or 7 deep, in ordinary clothes. A man in a mechanic's jacket. A girl, maybe 9, in a nightgown with a pattern on it. Dale said he shouted at them. He said out loud, "Hey, are you all right?" His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't keep them at his sides, and he told the investigator he could feel his own heartbeat in his teeth. Nobody in that room turned around. He said one of the beings put a hand on his shoulder, 3 fingers, cool, almost gentle, and moved him past the opening the way you'd move a child past something they shouldn't see. Dale came home. He was found at dawn, sitting on the running board of his own truck, still holding nothing. Now, here's where the conventional read of a case like this falls apart. For 50 years, the standard interpretation has been that abductees who report seeing other captives are experiencing confabulation, that the mind, under extreme stress, populates an empty room with familiar human shapes because a room full of strangers is easier to hold than a room full of the entity's black eyes. It's a reasonable theory. It's also the theory Vasseur herself started with, but she abandoned it, and she abandoned it for one reason. Confabulated details drift. They change between tellings. They absorb whatever the person read last week. They get more dramatic over time. The second room doesn't drift. Across her 31 subjects, the descriptions of that corridor and those standing rows were not just similar. They were, in her word, dimensionally consistent. Same depth, same rows, same silence, same refusal to look up when someone new is brought aboard. Cases like this one surface every few months, and almost none of them get covered anywhere outside a handful of private archives. So if you want the next one, the moment it comes to light, subscribing is genuinely the only way it'll reach you. Because the strongest account I've found isn't in any register at all. It's on a cassette tape, recorded in a hypnotic regression session in the spring of 1986, and the abductee is identified only by a bird name the researcher used for all his subjects. The file calls her Wren. She was a 38-year-old bookkeeper in a town on the Welsh border, and she'd come in for insomnia, not for a UFO. She had no memory of an encounter. What she had was a 2-hour gap on a drive home in October of 1985 and a burn on the inside of her wrist she couldn't account for. Under regression, she starts by describing the road, the hedge on the left, the radio going to static, which she narrates as an annoyance, not a threat. She says she reached down to change the station and her hand wouldn't come back up. Then the field, then the craft, sitting so low over the grass that she said it looked parked. And then she's inside, and the tape gets difficult because her voice changes register entirely. She says there's a doorway. She says there are people behind it, standing very still, and the light in there is different, older somehow, softer. And then she says something that made the researcher stop the session and start it again from the top because he thought he'd misheard her. She said, "The woman in the front row is wearing my coat." He asked her what she meant. She said the woman was turned 3/4 away and had her hair and her build and was wearing a green wool coat with a torn pocket that Wren had owned since her 20s. Her breathing on the tape goes fast and shallow. She's gripping the arms of the chair hard enough that the researcher notes it, and she says quietly, "I want to see her face." He asks her what happens. She says one of the beings steps into the doorway, not to stop her, just to stand there, the way a person stands in front of a photograph you weren't supposed to see. And she says the last thing she remembers is thinking, with perfect clarity, that if she saw that woman's face, she would never be allowed to go home. Wren woke up in her car on the verge, engine running, at 3:15 in the morning, which brings me to a man most people in this field will tell you was a fraud. Anders Holm was a Swedish clinical researcher who spent the better part of the 1990s collecting gray contact testimony across Scandinavia, and in 2001 he published a paper arguing that the second room wasn't a holding pen for abducted humans at all. His argument was that the standing figures aren't people who were taken. They're something the craft makes, copies, templates, rehearsals, and that the reason they never turn around is that there's nothing on the other side of them. 3 years later, Holm was accused of fabricating his interview transcripts by 2 of his own colleagues, and his reputation collapsed inside a single academic season. Here's the part that gets left out. The accusation was made because investigators found that 17 of Holm's subjects had given descriptions of the ship's interior that matched each other almost word for word, which the panel treated as proof he'd coached them. But Holm had recorded every session on video. He submitted the tapes. The panel reviewed them, quietly withdrew the fabrication charge in a document that was never circulated, and by then, nobody was listening. Holm never published again. He kept working, though, and the last interview he gave, in 2014, contains one sentence I haven't been able to shake. He said he'd stopped believing the standing figures were copies. He said, "The copies are the ones the Greys send back. I want to give you the numbers because they're worse than the anecdotes." Across every serious catalog of Grey abduction testimony assembled since 1960, Vasur's Register, Holm's Scandinavian Files, 3 independent American collections, the proportion of abductees who spontaneously report seeing other humans aboard the craft sits between 11 and 14%. That's stable across 4 decades and 5 languages. But when you filter for people who describe the standing rows specifically, rather than a single stranger on a table, the number drops to about 4%, and something strange happens to that 4%. They report longer missing time than any other category of abductee. The average across the general population of cases is somewhere near 2 hours. For the ones who saw the second room, it's closer to 9. Vasur had a phrase for them in her private notes, and it's the phrase I've used ever since. She called them the returned witnesses, not because they came back, but because coming back appeared to be the point. She believed they were shown that room deliberately, that the beings walked them past the opening at a pace slow enough to see and then sent them home to carry it. A message delivered in the only language that survives the trip, an image you can't stop describing and can't ever prove. The pattern doesn't stay in one country, and it doesn't stay in one decade. In 1961, a farmhand outside Santa Rosa, Argentina, was found wandering a highway at dawn, badly sunburned on one side of his body only, and told police he'd been on a craft where a room of people stood in rows under a light that didn't flicker. He said he counted them. He got to 60 and stopped because he recognized one. In 1988, a 15-year-old boy in North Yorkshire told his mother he'd woken up standing barefoot in the field behind their house with the glow of a ship still fading above the tree line, and for the rest of his life he drew the same picture: a doorway, rows of shoulders, no faces. In 2004, a fisherman in Hokkaido described being brought aboard through a beam of light off the coast and led past an opening where dozens of people stood facing away from him. He told the interviewer he shouted at them in Japanese, then in the only English he knew, and one of the gray-skinned beings looked at him, actually turned its head and looked at him, as though it were surprised he'd bothered. 3 men, 3 continents, 43 years between the first and the last. None of them ever met. None of them spoke a common language, and none of them could tell you why the rows never turn around. I don't know what that room is. I don't know whether it's a holding area, an archive, a nursery, a museum, or something that has no equivalent word in any language we've built. What I know is that the case files are full of people describing it, that their descriptions don't drift the way invented things drift, and that the ones who saw it were let go afterward every single time without exception. And that's the part I can't put down. Every account of the second room comes from someone who was allowed to leave. We've never heard a word from anyone standing in those rows, and we never will, because the ones we get back were all returned, and nobody has ever explained what it takes to be worth returning. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video.